Harry and Meghan Markle are once again under fire after a damning expose on the Sussexes was published by Hollywood Bible Vanity Fair.
You know that couple who left the royal family to escape the toxic media circus?
Vanity Fair has turned on them.
The ones who built an entire brand around compassion, mental health awareness, and breaking free from oppressive institutions?
Exiting their job or undergoing long-term therapy after working with Megyn.
Yeah, well, Vanity Fair just dropped a bombshell that's making everyone question whether we've been watching the greatest PR con of the decade.
They did this huge takedown on the Sussexes. They went really deep into some of those failed deals, especially the Spotify deal.
And I'm not talking about some random tabloid hit piece here. This is Vanity Fair, the Hollywood Bible, the magazine that once put Megyn on their cover when she got engaged to Harry and basically crowned her as modern royalty.
The sources were saying these are people that work directly with Meghan and Harry. They were saying that Harry was often quite uninterested.
But now they're painting a completely different picture, and the details are absolutely wild. Here's what's happening.
The person who interacted professionally with her says, I think if Megyn acknowledged her own shortcomings or personal contributions to situations, rather than staying trapped in a victim narrative, her perception might be better.
Multiple sources, former staff members, and people who work directly with the Sussexes are coming forward with stories that directly contradict everything this couple has been selling us. We're talking about employees taking extended leaves of absence, undergoing long-term therapy, and literally fleeing their jobs after working with Megyn.
It was almost kind of comical. They were talking about, the hours wasted trying to convince Prince Harry about podcast ideas.
One colleague connected to her Archetypes podcast reportedly worked on just 3 episodes before taking a leave of absence and then leaving Gimlet, the production company, entirely. Think about that for a second. 3 episodes. That's not a personality clash, that's a pattern. And the most devastating part? These aren't anonymous internet trolls making these claims. These are professionals who worked behind the scenes, people who saw what really happened when the cameras weren't rolling.
And going on to say the prince and the starlet, according to Vanity Fair, have become local villains in Montecito. Quoting someone as saying they are the most entitled, disingenuous people on the planet.
The person who really nailed it was a professional who interacted with Megyn directly. They said something that cuts right to the heart of the problem. I think if Megyn acknowledged her own shortcomings or personal contributions to situations rather than staying trapped in a victim narrative, her perception might be better. That's not coming from a place of hatred, that's actually incredibly fair criticism. But here's the kicker that's making people's jaws drop. This is the same woman who has spent years talking about compassion and mental health. It's literally on their website.
They moved from England to get away from the scrutiny of the press, supposedly, and all they do is try to get in the press in the United States. So what does all this tell us?
They position themselves as advocates for people struggling with mental health issues, particularly around online bullying and media scrutiny. Yet, according to Vanity Fair sources, staff members are ending up in therapy because of their work environment. The irony is almost too perfect. You probably think that's the whole story, but it's not even close. Let's talk about what's happening in their actual neighborhood, because this gets even more interesting.
But now it reveals that actually she in particular is a nasty little bully who sends staff into therapy. Think about that for a moment.
Vanity Fair didn't just report on workplace issues. They quoted local Montecito residents, and the responses are absolutely brutal. One person called them the most entitled, disingenuous people on the planet. Another pointed out the massive contradiction at the heart of their entire narrative. They moved from England, supposedly, to escape press scrutiny, and all they've done since arriving in the United States is chase press coverage. Every interview, every documentary, every tell-all book has been about getting their story into the media. So which is it? Are they victims of media intrusion, or are they media addicts who can't function without the spotlight?
This also follows all the stories about her bullying staff over here in the UK, which is unresolved. NDAs stopped all that stuff coming out, but she bullied people in a very unpleasant way over here.
The deeper you look into their California life, the more the cracks appear. Remember when they first moved to Montecito and everyone was like, oh, they're finally going to have privacy and peace? That lasted about 5 minutes before the Netflix cameras showed up. Then came the Oprah interview that broke the internet. Then Harry's memoir, where he shared incredibly private family details. Then more documentaries, more podcasts, more public appearances. For people who claimed they wanted to step back from public life, they sure seem to be working overtime to stay relevant. And here's where the timeline stops making sense. They left the royal family in 2020, citing mental health concerns and media harassment. But since then, they've voluntarily given more interviews, shared more personal information, and generated more headlines than they ever did as working royals.
So it's no surprise to people who work at Buckingham Palace. They saw and witnessed all this here. So I just showed, look, they're a pair of hypocrites, they're a pair of chancers, as the Spotify guy called them, a pair of effing grifters.
What makes this Vanity Fair piece so significant is the shift it represents. This isn't the British tabloids going after them anymore. This is the American media establishment, the very people who initially embraced them as victims of a cruel monarchy, now questioning the narrative. When Piers Morgan calls you grifters, you can write that off as a personal vendetta. But when Vanity Fair publishes detailed accounts from multiple sources about workplace toxicity, when your own neighbors are talking to reporters about how entitled you seem, when the Spotify executive literally calls you grifters after your deal falls apart, that's not a coordinated attack. That's a pattern emerging. And the public is starting to notice something that people close to the situation have apparently known for a while.
And they're desperately trying to maintain some kind of future as a renegade royal couple when they're no longer part of the royal family. The royals don't talk to them. You know, the king does not talk to his own son. None of the senior royals talk to these two.
The story they've been telling doesn't match the reality behind closed doors. Now let's connect some dots that make this whole situation even more ridiculous. Do you remember when they were constantly lecturing everyone about climate change and carbon footprints? They'd post these earnest messages about environmental responsibility while literally using Elton John and George Clooney's private jets like personal taxi services. The cognitive dissonance was already pretty strong then, but it gets better. On the same day Megyn had her $500,000 baby shower in New York, surrounded by celebrities and luxury, they posted from their Twitter account lecturing British people about poverty. You genuinely cannot make this stuff up. The awareness level is somewhere in the negatives. But the climate hypocrisy is just one example of a much bigger pattern. Let's talk about the privacy contradiction, because this one is absolutely wild.
They are total pariahs in the family because the only currency they have is trashing the royal family and the monarchy. And every time they try and do something else, nobody cares.
Harry has spent years now in an ongoing legal campaign against UK newspapers, claiming they invaded his privacy and the privacy of his family. He positions himself as this ethical crusader fighting for royal privacy rights. Meanwhile, he's the one who sat down with Oprah and shared private conversations with his father and brother. He's the one who wrote a memoir detailing incredibly personal family moments, including private arguments and intimate details that no one outside the family should know. He's the one who participated in a Netflix documentary that showed text messages, private photos, and behind-the-scenes family content. So let me get this straight. When newspapers report on you, that's a privacy invasion. But when you sell those exact same private details to Oprah, Netflix, and book publishers for millions of dollars, that's somehow different?
And that's what makes Prince Harry's ongoing campaign against the UK newspapers, which had another flare-up this week, so laughably hypocritical, because he talks about intrusion into royal privacy. And yet, if you ask any senior member of the royal family, who has invaded your privacy the worst, it's Prince Harry.
The royal family themselves have reportedly said that if you ask who has invaded royal privacy the worst, the answer is Harry, not the tabloids, not the paparazzi. Harry himself. He gave the inside track to anyone who would pay top dollar. He's shared details about conversations with his grandmother, the Queen, with his father, who's now King Charles, with his brother William, with Kate. He's discussed private family dynamics, personal struggles, and internal conflicts that traditionally never leave the palace walls. And yet he has the audacity to present himself as a champion of royal privacy and media ethics. The sheer lack of self-awareness is actually impressive in its own way. Keep this contradiction in mind because it becomes crucial when we look at how the public perception is shifting. Here's where things get genuinely strange.
It's the guy who gave the inside track for money to Oprah, to Netflix, to his publishers, to anyone who would pay top dollar. This guy invaded the privacy of his family.
The Vanity Fair article revealed something about their work ethic and ideas that's honestly shocking. According to sources, neither Megyn nor Harry showed up with any actual plans for how they were going to earn the massive amounts of money they were being offered. They had deals with Spotify, with Netflix, with publishers, but apparently no concrete ideas about what content they'd actually produce. Think about that. They secured multi-million-dollar contracts based essentially on their names and controversy, but didn't have a roadmap for delivering value. That's not how sustainable careers work. That's how grifting works. And then there's Harry's podcast idea, which is so absurdly tone-deaf, it's almost beautiful. He apparently wanted to get people like Vladimir Putin and Mark Zuckerberg to sit down with him for interviews. Already, that's a booking challenge that would make experienced journalists laugh. But wait, it gets better. His angle wasn't to discuss policy or technology or world affairs. No, Harry's brilliant insight was that everyone has childhood damage, including him, and he wanted to explore how childhood trauma turned people like Putin and Zuckerberg into sociopaths, while somehow he remained totally normal and not one of the bad guys. Let that sink in for a moment.
That their experiences had made them into sociopaths, according to Harry, and he wanted to explore how they became sociopaths, but he remained totally normal and was not, quote, one of these bad guys. And Vanity Fair pointing out, trying to get a season's worth of world-famous sociopaths to talk about how they developed sociopathy would be what is referred to in access journalism as a booking challenge.
He wanted world-famous, powerful people to come on his show and essentially admit they're sociopaths while he positioned himself as the emotionally healthy one. The person who has spent years publicly airing family grievances, who wrote a tell-all memoir trashing his relatives, who can't seem to maintain relationships with anyone in his family, thinks he's the baseline for normal psychological development. The level of delusion here is genuinely concerning. These are people who seem to have completely lost touch with how they're perceived. They don't understand why the Spotify deal failed. They don't grasp why nobody watched the Polo documentary. They can't figure out why people aren't interested in their content unless it involves trashing the royal family. And that's the real currency they have left. Every time they try to do something else, create content that stands on its own merit, the public response is complete indifference. But the moment they hint at more royal drama, more family secrets, more insider gossip, suddenly people pay attention. So they're trapped in this cycle where the only way to stay relevant is to keep betraying family confidences, which makes them increasingly toxic to work with and increasingly isolated from everyone who once supported them. Remember this pattern because it explains everything that happens next. Now we need to talk about what might be the most spectacularly ill-timed project in celebrity history. Megyn has a new lifestyle series coming out where she's essentially trying to be the next Martha Stewart. She's going to be cooking fancy food in her multi-million-dollar mansion with her celebrity friends, showing off her perfect California life. On paper, that's a pretty standard celebrity lifestyle show concept. But the timing and optics of this are so catastrophically bad that you have to wonder if anyone on their team understands public relations at all. This show was supposed to launch earlier, but it's been pushed to March. And here's why that matters. Los Angeles just experienced the most devastating fires in the city's history. Between 12,000 and 14,000 people lost their homes. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Families lost everything they owned. The images coming out of those fires were genuinely heartbreaking, with people evacuating in the middle of the night, watching their houses burn on live television, not knowing if they'd have anywhere to return to. And in the middle of this tragedy, Meghan Markle, who lives in a California mansion and constantly uses her Duchess title despite trashing the institution that gave it to her, is about to release a show where she cooks expensive food in a luxurious kitchen surrounded by famous friends. The optics are so unbelievably inappropriate that it's actually stunning the show is still going forward. This is the same person who lectures people about compassion and awareness, the same person who positions herself as being in touch with regular people's struggles. And she either doesn't see the problem or doesn't care that launching a luxury lifestyle show while thousands of Californians are displaced from wildfires sends a message of complete detachment from reality. It's the baby shower situation all over again, but somehow worse. At least with the baby shower, the poverty lecture tweet was probably scheduled in advance by a social media manager who didn't realize the timing. But this lifestyle show has been in production for months. There have been opportunities to delay it, to reframe it, to do literally anything to avoid looking completely tone deaf. And yet, it's still happening. That's not just bad PR, that's a fundamental failure to read the room on a scale that's actually impressive. This moment right here might be when the last bit of public goodwill finally evaporates completely. So what happens when literally everyone starts turning on you? Because that's where we are now. The British press has been critical for years, but that was expected and honestly helped their narrative as victims. But now the American media is turning. Vanity Fair's piece isn't an isolated incident. There's been a steady drumbeat of negative coverage, failed projects, and former allies distancing themselves. The Spotify deal ended with that executive calling them grifters. The Netflix content has largely been ignored unless it contained royal drama. The podcast never found an audience. The book sales were strong initially, but driven entirely by controversy, not sustainable interest in their perspective. And here's what's really interesting about the staff bullying allegations. This isn't new information. When Meghan and Harry were still in the UK, there were reports about her behavior toward palace staff. Multiple employees reportedly complained about her management style, but those stories got buried behind NDAs and the palace's traditional approach of not commenting publicly on internal matters. The assumption was that maybe the British environment was just a bad fit, maybe the royal system was too rigid, maybe she'd thrive in a more relaxed California setting. But now we're seeing the exact same pattern emerge with American staff. People are taking leaves of absence, they're undergoing therapy, they're leaving positions entirely after brief stints working with her. That's not a cultural clash, that's a personality issue. What makes this particularly damaging is how it undermines their entire brand. They've built their post-royal identity on being compassionate, being advocates for mental health, being the good guys who left a toxic institution. But if you're creating a toxic environment yourself, if your employees are ending up in therapy, if you can't maintain functional working relationships with the people around you, then what exactly are you selling? The whole narrative falls apart, and people close to the situation are starting to say the quiet part out loud. That quote about Megyn needing to acknowledge her own shortcomings instead of staying trapped in a victim narrative, that's devastating because it's so clearly true to anyone paying attention. Every problem is someone else's fault. Every failure is because of racism or media bias or institutional resistance. There's never any self-reflection, never any admission that maybe their approach isn't working, never any genuine accountability, and the public is exhausted by it. Here's the brutal truth about where this all ends up. The royal family has moved on. King Charles reportedly doesn't speak to Harry. William certainly doesn't. The senior royals have cut them off completely, not out of spite, but because maintaining any relationship means risking that private conversations will end up in the next interview or memoir. The family learned that lesson the hard way. And while that's sad on a human level, it's also a natural consequence of repeatedly betraying people's trust for profit. You can't sell out your family for money and then expect them to keep taking your calls. The public has moved on too. The initial sympathy after the Oprah interview has long since faded. People have heard the same grievances repeated so many times that they've lost impact. The racism allegations were serious and deserved attention, but when that gets mixed in with complaints about not getting a tiara you wanted or being upset about where you rank in the royal hierarchy, it dilutes the legitimate concerns. And the constant media presence while claiming to want privacy has made people cynical about every statement they make. It's become background noise. Nobody cares about the polo documentary. Nobody's excited about the lifestyle show. The only time people pay attention is when there's new royal drama to dissect, which means their entire relevance depends on continuing to trash the family that gave them the platform they're exploiting. And now the media is turning. When Vanity Fair, which once celebrated Megyn as a modern icon, publishes detailed allegations about workplace toxicity, that's not journalism, that's a cultural shift. The same outlets that protected their image are now questioning whether they've been conned. The Hollywood elite, who initially embraced them as victims of a cruel monarchy, are quietly distancing themselves. The people who matter in the entertainment industry, the ones who greenlight projects and sign checks, are watching the pattern of failed ventures and reconsidering whether associating with the Sussexes is worth the hassle. So what comes next? They're facing something they can't fight with interviews or lawsuits or social media statements. They're facing irrelevance. And irrelevance is far worse than bad publicity because at least bad publicity means people are paying attention. When no one cares anymore, when your name doesn't generate clicks, when your projects get quietly canceled instead of controversially attacked, that's when you know it's truly over. Piers calls them grifters. Locals call them entitled. Former staff call them difficult to work with. But the harshest judgment might be silence. when the next royal documentary barely registers, when the lifestyle show launches to indifferent reviews, when even the gossip sites stop covering their latest statements because readers aren't clicking. The fairy tale they sold us, the one about escaping oppression to build an authentic life of service and compassion, has been exposed as something much more calculated and much less admirable. They're not heroes or victims anymore. They're just celebrities who overplayed their hand, burned their bridges, and are now discovering that fame without credibility is a ticking time bomb. The royal family will be fine. The institution has survived far worse than 2 disgruntled former members. But for Meghan and Harry, the question burning louder than ever is what happens when the audience stops believing, when the spotlight finally goes dark, and when the only currency you have is a story no one wants to hear anymore. Because for people whose entire existence depends on attention, irrelevance isn't just career death, it's the end of everything they've built their identity around. And that reckoning might be the most devastating chapter yet.